Adolf Hitler was, among many things of course, a man who was passionate about architecture. As such, Nazi German architecture would reflect Hitler's own design ideals, and he was heavily involved in all major infrastructure projects. Hitler's architectural ideals tended to involve vast constructs in a neoclassical style which seemed to exude power and authority. The Führer wanted a 1,000-year Reich and monuments that could stand the test of time, but he wasn't interested in building only for show. He was insistent that form should follow function. For a long time, Hitler had struggled to find an architect who could realise his visions of Germany, and particularly Berlin. That was until he came into contact with a young middle to upper class architect by the name of Albert Speer in the 1930s. A charming and well-spoken man, Speer had joined the Nazi Party in 1931 after watching Hitler give a speech about love. He went on to become one of Hitler's closest confidants, becoming a member of the Führer's inner circle, and at one point being almost his right-hand man. Speer earned Hitler's trust, particularly following his plans to renovate Berlin in what was to become Germania. Many architects had been tasked with producing a vision for Germania, but none came close to what Hitler had in mind before Speer, who produced the plans in record time. Hitler and Speer's plans for the New Berlin are well known to those with an interest in World War II and the history of the Third Reich, but the Führer's plans for a new mega stadium in Nuremberg that would dwarf any other existing stadium on Earth have rather been forgotten. Nuremberg was a city close to Hitler's heart and the home of the Nazis' annual rallies which took place on rally grounds designed by Speer. It was in Nuremberg that Hitler planned to build the Third Reich's monumental arena that would be called the Deutsches Stadion. With a projected capacity of 405,000, the stadium would have been, and would still be, by far the largest on Earth. The Strahov Stadium was then, and indeed remains to this day, the largest stadium ever built, with a capacity of 220,000, followed by the Maracanã in Rio de Janeiro, which could house 200,000 at its peak, and then the Circus Maximus in Rome, which was the most impressive venue in ancient Rome with a capacity of 150,000. It was the Circus Maximus that the Deutsches Stadion would most closely resemble of the three, despite being built much closer in time to the other two. Speer maintained even after the end of the war that the Deutsches Stadion was based on Greek rather than Roman design, more aligned with the Panathenaic Stadium in Athens than the Circus Maximus in Rome. His peers aren't quite in agreement, with the design and building materials being observed by fellow architects to be more similar to that of the Roman construct. For the most part, Nazi architecture tended to be a mix of the Roman and Greek design, but with an unquestionable lean towards the Roman style. This wasn't the first ambitious stadium project made by Hitler, as Germany had won the rights to host the Olympics in 1931, whilst Hitler became Chancellor and the Nazis really came to power in Germany in 1933. Germany had hosted the Olympics as recently as 1916, for which architect Otto Mark had been commissioned to build an arena which could accommodate 64,000 people, also called the Deutsches Stadion. Weimar Germany planned on hosting the 1936 Olympics at the same venue, but Hitler had other ideas, and immediately after coming to power, he set about with his intentions of building a sporting village that would impress the world. Hitler had originally looked down on the Olympics, dismissing it as a project of Jews and Freemasons. But by the time of 1933, the Nazis had become masters of propaganda, and Hitler saw the Games as a fantastic opportunity to show off the new Germany to the world. Otto Mark's Deutsches Stadion was demolished, and his son, who was also a prominent German architect, was commissioned to design its replacement. The Olympic Stadium opened in 1936 with a capacity somewhere between 100 and 115,000. Clearly that was far too small for Hitler's liking, and the new Deutsches Stadion in Nuremberg would be 3.5 times the size. The new stadium would host the annual Nuremberg rallies, a pan-Germanic athletics competition, and, since Hitler assumed that once he won the war, the world would have no choice but to let Germany host every Olympic Games, the stadium would also host the Games every 4 years, although Hitler was already planning to rebrand and reorganise the Olympic Games as the Aryan Games. The site of the Deutsches Stadion in Nuremberg covered around 60 acres, and the stadium itself would be made up of a whopping 5 tiers. The exterior would feature distinctive pink granite blocks 90 metres in height, along with a series of arches resting on a podium of dark red granite. Speer had rejected the initial amphitheatre-style oval-shape suggestion in favour of a horseshoe shape. As the scale of the project and both the materials and labour became clear, Speer tried to stress to Hitler the extortionate cost associated with building such a stadium. Unmoved, Hitler retorted that it would cost less than 2 ships of the Bismarck class. In later life, Speer described Hitler as an architect's dream since finances were never an issue. Initially, a model of the Deutsches Stadion was built in the small village of Hirschbach in Bavaria as a prototype for Speer's plans, which still stands today, albeit in a state of disrepair. The next step was a test construction site just outside of Nuremberg, the remnants of which can still be seen here. Hitler laid the cornerstone for the Deutsches Stadion with his own hands in 1937, which was scheduled for completion in 1943, a sign of his close involvement and interest in the project. But as with so many of Hitler and Speer's fantastic plans, defeat for Germany in the war meant they were never realised. As the war intensified and the Axis powers began to suffer their first major defeats, Hitler found a new role for Speer. The architect had exhibited not just his flair for design to the Führer, but also his efficiency and ability to work to tight deadlines and maximise productivity. When the Reich Minister for Armaments and Ammunition Fritz Todt died mysteriously when his plane unexplainably exploded mid-air in 1942, the role was pivotal to Hitler's war effort and considered among the most prestigious in the land. Goering wanted the job, but Hitler shocked those around him by giving it to his architect instead, and Speer went from being tacitly complicit in the Nazi war machine to being a key cog within it. It proved to be a shrewd appointment as Speer generated remarkable productivity. With the German tactic of blitzkrieg having faltered en route to Moscow, a swift path to victory no longer seemed possible. It would now be more of a slog, and Speer had to adjust production accordingly to something more long-term and sustainable. Speer promised retribution for the bombing of German cities by the British in September 1943 with a secret weapon, referring to the V weapons, most notably the V1 and V2 rockets. These would be the weapons that proved Speer's efficiency and effectiveness as Minister of Armaments, as he managed to scale production despite the V2 plant being completely destroyed by the RAF. All of Speer's tasks required manpower, something that was in limited supply for all nations actively involved in World War II. Whilst the Allied powers brought women into the workforce to ramp up production, Hitler flat out refused to do so, even upon Speer's request. Instead, the architect could call upon the services of inmates at the nearby Buchenwald concentration camp to do his bidding. Jews, Poles, Romani, homosexuals, political opponents, POWs, and all the other so-called enemies of the Reich could be found at Buchenwald, where 56,545 of the 280,000 prisoners who passed through its doors were killed. There were no gas chambers at Buchenwald, and whilst inmates were executed or died due to depraved human experiments, the vast majority were simply worked to death. Vernichten durch Arbeit, literally meaning extermination through labour, was a Nazi practice designed to use and eradicate undesirables. Speer opposed this, reportedly not due to any humanitarian reasons, but simply because he felt it was poor for productivity and unsustainable. When he found out his workers were on starvation rations, he was angered and asked Hitler to feed his Buchenwald task force properly, which Hitler agreed to. In the eyes of Speer's biographer, if Hitler had a son, he would have wanted him to be Speer, who some described as essentially being the Führer's right-hand man at times. Despite Speer's success in terms of production, the Allies continued to push the Axis forces back from 1942 onwards. Following D-Day and the liberation of Paris in June 1944, German defeat seemed inevitable. The Soviets pushed through on the east, and the Western Allies began sweeping the Germans aside throughout 1945, and Berlin was captured in late April. Hitler and several other high-ranking Nazis committed suicide, others fled, and the rest were captured to be put on trial in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg trials were controversial within and outside of Germany for a number of reasons, and they weren't the only trials of Nazi war criminals. The Nuremberg trials were reserved only for the most high-profile and high-ranking surviving Nazis, numbering 24 in total, one of whom committed suicide before the trials began, one who was excused due to ill health, and another who was tried in absentia, later found to have died shortly before the war ended. Speer was one of the 21 Nazis on trial and present in Nuremberg, 11 of whom were sentenced to death by hanging, 3 to life imprisonment, 4 to sentences between 10 and 20 years, and 3 acquitted. Some of Germany's finest lawyers were tasked with defending the Nazis on trial, most of whom tried to absolve themselves of any blame by claiming they were just following orders and would have been killed had they not done so. Goering tried to dictate the proceedings, taking notes, laughing, shaking his head, and whispering to co-defendants whilst proceedings went on. Speer, who was a shrewd, well-spoken bourgeoisie-type character, decided to take a different approach. He too pled not guilty, but claimed not to be following orders, but entirely ignorant. He told the judges he was unaware of the mass genocide taking place in Germany and threw his less charming deputy Fritz Sauckel under the bus when it came to the question of slave labour, claiming he knew nothing of that as well. Speer knew the Nazis were viewed as monsters, he knew Goering and his cohorts were fitting that perception, and he was smart enough to know what people wanted to hear. So Speer said sorry. Not sorry because he was to blame for the immeasurable cruelty and suffering inflicted by the Nazis, but sorry because he ought to have realised but didn't. Speer was acquitted, and his tax spared him the noose. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, which he served at Spandau prison, being released in October 1966 at the age of 61. Speer announced that he planned to return to his passion of architecture, but he would instead become a best-selling author with the release of his memoirs entitled Inside the Third Reich. Following his release, Speer actually became a rather popular public figure. Within Germany, he was viewed favourably by many since the idea that Speer, who had been so close to Hitler, if he knew nothing of the persecution of the Jews and the atrocities his country carried out, then how could everyday Germans be expected to know anything? Speer spared older Germans of any blame for the appalling acts the Nazis carried out. Outside of Germany, it was arguably even worse. There was a fascination with Speer, who was erudite, illuminating, and could provide insight into the most senior figures from within the Nazi party. He was sometimes nicknamed the Nazi who said sorry, or even more extraordinarily, the good Nazi. Over the years, the absurdity of the Speer myth has been repeatedly exposed. The idea that someone who was as close to Hitler as almost anyone else, and was the commander-in-chief when it came to the use of slave labour, knew nothing of the concentration camps is as ludicrous as it sounds. Fine historians have combed through Speer's memoirs, redacted and unredacted, his interview claims, and his whereabouts throughout the war, proving that he unquestionably had to be aware of German atrocities. Speer was a wily character and a fine manipulator. He knew how to please and pander to Hitler, and he knew exactly what people wanted to hear at Nuremberg. He carefully constructed a mythology around himself that somehow managed to shake off scrutiny up until his death. Photos have since been discovered of Speer at a concentration camp in 1942, among other things, which if present at the trials in Nuremberg would surely have led to him hanging. Instead, he died in London in 1981, aged 76, having suffered a stroke whilst visiting his mistress and taking part in one of several interviews he did with the BBC for TV programmes they produced. The son of an architect named Albert Speer, Speer's own son was named Albert and went on to become an architect as well. The younger Speer was born in 1934 and described Hitler as having been like a friendly uncle during the war. Speer respected his father as an architect, but the two were not close despite sharing a profession. Unlike his father, Speer Jr., as I'll call him, will have his stadium designs realised. A key figure in Beijing's successful 2008 Olympic bid and Munich's unsuccessful 2018 Winter Olympic bid, among others, Speer's office, were put in charge of Qatar's winning 2022 World Cup bid. Speer was involved with everything from designing a satellite city outside of Cairo for 3 million people to buying Munich's Allianz Arena, and his team's designs were said to be crucial in Qatar's successful bid to host the finals in 2022. FIFA requires 12 stadiums for a nation to hold the World Cup finals, so that is what Speer and his 160 staff designed. Speer Jr. died in September 2017, aged 83, not living long enough to see his plans completed in Qatar, but long enough to see what are essentially slaves working on his projects, just like his father.